Hollywood can erase a person with praise. In 1979, one slow-motion scene in 10 turned Bo Derek into America's perfect 10 and reduced a 22-year-old woman to a single digit. For the world, she became a fantasy. For Bo herself, that number became a cage. Almost overnight, America turned her image into an obsession and her body into public property. But a number allows no room for a soul. Before anyone asked what kind of artist she wanted to become, the industry had already decided what she was required to remain: young, desirable, silent, and frozen inside the fantasy that made her famous. What follows is not the standard autopsy of a faded sex symbol, but the heavy, quiet reckoning of a woman who had to survive the camera that helped build her cage, outlive the myth that simplified her, and find a world where she no longer had to be scored. How does a human being step out of a perfect illusion? Before the world knew Bo Derek, Mary Kathleen Collins still belonged to ordinary things: salt air, horses, school days she did not always obey, and a Southern California freedom that had not yet been turned into an image. That freedom looked endless only because no one had yet priced it. Born on November 20th, 1956, in Long Beach, California, she did not grow up inside a carefully planned Hollywood destiny. She grew up near the coast, closer to beaches, sunlight, surfing, and restless motion than to studio discipline. Long before fame found her, Mary was moving toward a future she could not yet understand, a future that would ask her to leave more of her old self behind than any young girl should be able to measure. She was close to Hollywood, but not in the grand way people imagine. Her mother worked as a hairdresser and makeup artist for performers, connected to the backstage world of stars. Her stepfather, Bobby Bass, was a stuntman, a man whose work lived beside the film industry, but often outside its bright center. In that house, Hollywood was not a distant dream. It was a side door reached through work, phone calls, set visits, and people who knew how the business moved when the audience was not watching. Mary was a California girl whose life leaned more toward the sea than school. According to later accounts, she was not deeply committed to structured education. Once she left school for a while to go to the beach, a small detail, but one that reveals the rhythm of her youth: free, impulsive, unconventional, and not yet arranged around a film career. Years later, when asked about the name Bo, she answered with striking simplicity, "I made it up." The line sounded almost playful, but history would make it heavier. A name invented casually would soon become the name the world preferred over the girl who invented it. Mary Collins did not simply change her stage name. She began to move away from her real name. The tragedy was not that Mary Collins became Bo Derek. It was that Bo Derek would become easier for the world to love than the young woman who had carried the old name. That door opened when Mary was still a teenager. She met John Derek during the making of his film, Fantasies. John was an actor and director much older than she was, already tied to old Hollywood, and at the time married to actress Linda Evans. The age difference, his marriage, and Mary's youth would make the relationship a subject of debate for years afterward. But inside the life as it was happening, it did not yet have the warning label history would later place on it. It was a young girl stepping away from school, away from an ordinary path, and into the orbit of a man who understood cameras, beauty, distance, and the power of turning a face into a myth. From then on, Mary Collins began to fade from everyday paperwork, while Bo Derek gradually emerged in the first frames of the screen. The new name was short, sharp, and memorable, more like something made for a poster than for an old California classroom. Before America saw her as a perfect 10, the first transformation had already happened. A girl of the sea had stepped into a lens older, sharper, and far more certain of what it wanted her to become. From that point on, Mary Collins would become harder to find, while Bo Derek became easier to sell. Ahead lay Hollywood, where a face could be lifted very quickly, then held for years inside the single moment that made it famous. Hollywood did not ask who Bo Derek wanted to become. It asked her to remain inside the image that had already sold too well. In 1979, at 22, Ten turned a young actress into one of the most recognizable faces in America almost overnight, but the miracle came with a lock on it. The film was built around George Weber, played by Dudley Moore, a man moving through the panic of middle age and projecting his hunger for perfection onto a young woman he barely knew. Bo's character, Jenny Hanley, did not need many lines to change her life. She only needed to be seen in the exact way the camera, the audience, and the culture were ready to consume her. That was the dangerous power of 10. The movie gave Bo Derek instant fame, but it also gave the public a shortcut. Instead of meeting her slowly as an actress, audiences received her as a completed image. The nickname Perfect 10 traveled faster than any character detail, faster than any performance discussion, faster than any question about the woman who still had to live behind the image. A number became easier to remember than a person. For Bo, the success was both dazzling and narrowing. A first breakthrough should open doors. Hers created a frame. The applause did not open the room. It closed it around her. After 10, the public did not simply wonder what she would do next. They wondered whether she could return them to the feeling they already associated with her. That is a painful difference. Curiosity allows an actress to grow. Expectation asks her to repeat. Almost immediately, Bo Derek became tied to repetition before she had the chance to build range. The image spread everywhere. Posters, magazine covers, interviews, entertainment columns, living rooms, late-night jokes, and conversations among people who may not have remembered Jenny Hanley's story, but remembered the number attached to her. Hollywood understood the commercial power of that memory. It did not need to know her better. It only needed to point back to the moment that had already entered popular culture. The more famous she became, the less room there seemed to be for uncertainty, awkwardness, contradiction, growth, or reinvention. Fame had made her visible, but not necessarily more knowable. Years later, Bo looked back on that period with unusual clarity and said, "I objectified myself." The line matters because it refuses an easy story. It does not turn her into a helpless victim, and it does not excuse the industry around her. It shows something more uncomfortable, a young woman who understood the attention, participated in the image, benefited from it, and still had to live inside its limits. Bo was not simply dragged into a machine she never saw coming. She stepped into a system that rewarded the image first and asked the human questions later. That is why 10 became both the beginning and the trap. The number sounded like praise. In Hollywood, praise can become a contract no one admits you signed. It told the world what to see before Bo had time to show what else she could be. From that moment on, every room carried the old comparison. Every camera seemed to ask for the earlier version. Every new role had to compete with a memory that would not loosen its grip. Bo Derek did not become famous because America understood her. She became famous because America simplified her. And for years after 10, the hardest part of her story was not being forgotten. It was being remembered too narrowly, too loudly, and too permanently by a number that left very little space for the woman behind it. After 10, the question was no longer whether Bo Derek could be seen. It was whether anyone around her would allow the image to change. Her name carried a number, her image carried a demand, and every new room seemed to remember what it wanted from her before it asked what she might become. For most actresses, identity is built slowly, role by role, mistake by mistake, surprise by surprise. Bo was denied that slower mercy. She arrived almost fully packaged, a short name, a famous image, a body the culture already knew how to discuss, and a public trained to recognize her before it understood her. The very thing that made her valuable made her road dangerously narrow. The industry was not asking how she might grow. It was asking how long the same fascination could keep selling. John Derek stood at the center of that narrowing, but his role cannot be flattened into a simple villain behind the camera. He was her husband, her collaborator, and the man who believed most deeply in the image the world had already rewarded. He came from another Hollywood, one that trusted lighting, distance, silence, and the camera's power to turn a face into myth. To him, Bo was not only the woman he loved, she was also an image he believed cinema could build around. That is where the story becomes complicated and more painful. Love, marriage, ambition, protection, control, and image were not neatly separated. The same lens that admired her also narrowed her. The same partnership that gave her visibility also made escape more difficult. That was the uneasy truth inside their work together. John Derek's camera did not create the whole cage by itself. Hollywood, the press, audiences, and Bo's own choices all helped fasten it. But his camera kept returning to the image with unusual faith, as if the fantasy could be protected from time by being filmed again. The public saw glamour. The industry saw a brand. John saw an image he believed in, and behind all of it was Mary Collins, the young woman who had once belonged to beaches, horses, and ordinary Southern California days before a number learned to speak louder than her name. The longer that image survived, the harder it became for Mary to step forward. In the end, the cruelest part was not that Bo Derek became visible. It was that the visibility came shaped so tightly that the woman inside it had to spend years trying to breathe. The films that followed 10 did not simply test Bo Derek's acting career. They tested whether Hollywood could see her after it had already decided what she was for. In theory, success should have given her more choices. In practice, it asked her to repeat the same promise under different titles, different locations, and different lighting. That was the danger of becoming famous through an image before being allowed to develop as an actress. Every new project carried the old expectation into the room. Tarzan, the Ape Man, arrived in 1981. Only 2 years after 10 had made Bo a national name. John Derek directed it with the belief that her screen presence could carry the project, and the campaign understood exactly what audiences remembered. It did not invite them to meet a new Bo. It invited them back to the fascination they already knew. The film drew attention, but attention is not the same as respect. Critics were harsh, and Bo's name became tied to the kind of reaction no actress wants to carry into her next chapter. The deeper sadness was not simply that the film was criticized, it was that the criticism made the frame around her tighter. Instead of helping Bo step beyond 10, it confirmed for many people that she belonged only to the image that had made her famous. That is how Hollywood can trap a person twice. First, it rewards one version of them. Then, when that version begins to fail, it blames the person for not becoming someone else sooner. By 1984, Bolero showed how dangerous that loop had become. Another John Derek project, another attempt to build around the same narrow understanding of Bo's appeal, another film asking an older fantasy to keep producing the same heat. But culture had begun to move. The world that once rushed toward the image was becoming less patient with it, and Bo was caught in the cruel middle, still too famous to be seen with fresh eyes, but no longer protected by the fascination that had made her famous. That was the real decline. It was not just smaller critical respect or harsher reviews. It was a change in the way people entered the room around her, less curious, more amused, already prepared to dismiss her before she had a chance to surprise them. Reviews were again severe, and the public conversation around her shifted from possibility to limitation. A woman once introduced to America as an impossible ideal was now being discussed through disappointment. Ghosts can't do it. In 1989 made the pattern even harder to escape. By then, the issue was no longer one film, one review, or one award season joke at her expense. The issue was the loop itself. Each new attempt to use the image made it feel older. Each disappointment made it harder for people to imagine her differently. Bo was not simply losing roles. She was losing the right to be approached with curiosity. The more the films tried to return audiences to the old fantasy, the more they proved that a fantasy cannot carry a woman's whole life. The tragedy was not that Bo Derek stopped being admired in the same way. The tragedy was that the admiration had never given her enough space to become fully human on screen. Hollywood had taught audiences to respond to a symbol, then seemed confused when the symbol could not carry an entire career by itself. Bo did not fall from the sky in one dramatic crash. She moved through a slower kind of loss: the loss of room, the loss of reinvention, the loss of being approached with curiosity instead of memory. That kind of decline is almost more painful because it does not announce itself honestly. One day, the public is not asking what else you might become. It is only asking why you are no longer producing the feeling it remembers. By the end of the 1980s, Bo Derek was no longer simply living in the aftermath of 10. She was living in the aftermath of being simplified. The number had opened the door, but it had also followed her into every room after that. And as Hollywood changed around her, the question became more painful. Where does a woman go when the image that made her famous becomes the very thing that keeps her from moving forward? The industry did not need to slam the door on Bo Derek. It only had to change the rules after rewarding her for obeying the old ones. Hollywood always changes its faces, its fantasies, and the stories it believes it can sell. But for Bo, the shift cut deeper. For years, the business had rewarded her for belonging to one unforgettable image. Then the rules changed. Women on screen were being asked to arrive with flaws, sharper voices, messier choices, fuller lives. The culture was not suddenly fair. Hollywood still judged women harshly, especially as they aged. But the screen had changed enough that an image built around distance, fantasy, and silence began to feel like a relic from another room. Bo was not unknown. In some ways, she was too known. That was the trap. A new actress could walk into a role with mystery. Bo walked in with a label already waiting. Before she could surprise anyone, the room had already decided what joke, memory, or fantasy she belonged to. That is a lonely kind of fame. Recognition worked against understanding. It made her easy to describe and hard to rediscover. The old beach memory, the number, the magazine shorthand, the jokes, the repeated summaries of her career, all of it arrived before she did. Bo spoke about the sex symbol label without asking to be pitied. At one point she said, "I'm not complaining." The sentence matters because it refuses self-pity. She was not trying to rewrite fame as if it had given her only pain. It had given her money, access, recognition, and a permanent place in cultural memory. But calmness is not the same as absence of cost. A person can be grateful for a door and still know that the room behind it was too small. And for Bo, the room had become smaller, just as the world outside it was asking women to become larger, louder, stranger, and more fully human. Through that uncertainty, John Derek remained the most complicated constant in her life. From a distance, their relationship could be debated as power, scandal, age, influence, and control. Inside Bo's life, it was also marriage, work, habit, loyalty, dependence, memory, and the familiar presence of the man behind the camera. When Hollywood's old fantasy stopped working, John remained tied to the world that had made Bo Derek possible. He was not only part of the cage, he was part of the life inside it. For better or worse, he was one of the few people who remembered Mary before the world knew how to score Bo. And just as the public gaze moved elsewhere, the last person still holding that old world together was beginning to slip from her life. The cruelest turning point in Bo Derek's life did not come from a review, a box office failure, or another joke about the number that had followed her for years. It came home. It came when the man who had stood behind the camera for most of her adult life was no longer there to stand anywhere at all. When John Derek died in 1998, Bo was 41, old enough to understand the cost of the life they had built, but still young enough to keep living inside its aftermath. She did not only lose a husband, she lost the director, collaborator, witness, architect, and most complicated constant in the story of Bo Derek. For more than 2 decades, John had been tied to almost every major chapter of her public identity. The man who met Mary Collins when she was still very young, the man whose lens helped shape Bo Derek, the husband who loved her, the director who framed her, the older Hollywood figure whose belief in beauty, silence, distance, and myth helped turn a young woman into an image the world could not stop repeating. He had helped build the cage, but he had also lived inside its consequences with her. That is what made the grief so difficult to name. From the outside, people could debate him as power, scandal, age, influence, control, and controversy. From inside Bo's life, he was also breakfast light, familiar footsteps, shared work, private language, old arguments, loyalty, dependence, memory, and the voice that remained through the long years after the applause changed temperature. There was no clean way to mourn a relationship that had never been clean in the public imagination. Bo's life with John had begun in a place history would never let become simple. He was much older, he was married to Linda Evans. Bo was still very young. Those facts did not disappear because time passed. Bo herself would later speak of Linda with a remorse that still sounded alive. "That still breaks my heart," she said of the pain caused at the beginning of her life with John. She would also say she was forever sorry to Linda. Those words matter because they keep the story from becoming a fantasy of innocence or a cheap trial of guilt. They make it human. They remind us that love can be real, and still leave damage behind. That a life can be built from a beginning no one can make spotless afterward. People want love stories to be innocent or guilty, pure or unforgivable, but real lives rarely obey those clean categories. John Derek was not only the man who shaped the fantasy. He was the man Bo ate meals with, worked beside, aged beside, defended, depended on, argued with, remembered with, and lost. Grief does not arrive as a public debate. It does not ask whether strangers approve of the life being mourned. It arrives in the house. It arrives in the empty chair, the quiet room, the missing voice, the routine that suddenly has nowhere to go. It arrives in the ordinary, terrible moment when a person reaches for the rhythm of a life and finds silence where another human being used to be. To the world, John Derek remained a controversial figure in Bo Derek's story. To Bo, he was also one of the few people who remembered Mary before the world knew how to score Bo. Before the posters, before the jokes, before America found it easier to keep the image than understand the woman underneath. And then, in 1998, that witness was gone. After John's death, Bo did not vanish in one dramatic collapse. That would have been easier for the public to understand. Her retreat was quieter, lonelier, and more human than that. It looked like a woman stepping out of a room where the lights had been too bright for too many years, only to realize that the person who had always stood near the switch was gone. The old camera was gone. The old partnership was gone. The machinery that had created the image no longer had the same power. What remained was not the perfect 10, not the poster, not the fantasy, not the joke, not the shorthand America had used for so long. What remained was a woman in middle age, carrying grief, contradiction, remorse, memory, and the strange task of asking who she might be when her life no longer had to be arranged around the image that made her famous. That was the real rupture, not the reviews, not the box office, not the fading of one kind of glamour. The rupture was the silence after John Derek was no longer there. In that silence, Bo had to begin again without the man who helped create her public life, without the old Hollywood language that had narrowed her, without the familiar lens that had both adored and confined her, and without the illusion that being remembered by millions is the same as being truly known. For the first time in decades, Bo Derek was left with the most frightening freedom of all. A life no longer scored by the world. A life no longer held together by the man who had helped teach the world how to look at her. The life that followed was quieter, but it was not empty. For Bo Derek, the years after Hollywood's brightest gaze became years of open land, horses, dogs, routines, causes, and a different kind of purpose. This world did not ask her to be a number. It did not need her to stand inside an old image. It asked for patience, steadiness, and presence. For a woman once reduced to a score, there was dignity in choosing a life that could not be scored. She lived for many years near Santa Barbara, far from the old rhythm of premieres, flashbulbs, and constant public inspection. Horses became more than a decorative detail in the life of a former star. They became part of her daily world, part of the patience and discipline she wrote about in riding lessons, and part of the causes she would later support. Her work in animal welfare, her opposition to horse slaughter, and her service on the California Horse Racing Board were not glamorous roles in the old Hollywood sense. They did not ask her to be desired, frozen, or remembered at 22. They required showing up, listening, learning, and caring about lives that could not give her back the kind of applause a movie audience once did. And perhaps that was the point. After years of being watched for beauty, Bo found meaning in a world that asked her to be useful. In 2006, Bo was appointed by the U.S. State Department as Special Envoy for Wildlife Trafficking Issues. That title could not have been further from the label that first followed her across America. It belonged to a different woman, or perhaps to the same woman finally seen from a different angle. No famous number, no old cinematic shorthand, no need to recreate the image that had made her known. Just responsibility, awareness, protection, and the quiet use of visibility for something beyond herself. She also became involved in supporting veterans, especially through rehabilitation events for wounded servicemen, entering spaces where fame mattered only if it could serve another life. America kept the image, the number, the poster, the slow-motion memory, the fantasy that once made her impossible to ignore. Bo kept living beyond it. That may be the quietest revenge against a number, not to erase it, but to stop obeying it. She did not need to defeat the old image by returning to the screen and proving everyone wrong. She outlived it by building a life where the image no longer had the final word. At 69, Bo Derek stands far from the old machinery of being scored, remembered, and frozen at 22. The old image still belongs to movie memory, but the life after it belongs to her. She deserves to be remembered not only for the face America could not forget, but for the woman who kept living after that face stopped protecting her. She was Mary Collins before the number. She was Bo Derek inside the storm of fame. And in time, she became a woman who found meaning beyond the frame that had once held her too tightly. Her most human victory was not becoming a fantasy. It was surviving one, carrying its cost, and reaching a life where the number no longer had permission to speak for her. Beyond the perfect 10, what word would you leave for Bo Derek? Share it below. Like this video, subscribe to Hollywood Faded, and stay with us for more quiet, Hollywood retrospectives told with respect for the life behind the image.